We live in exciting times for entrepreneurs. There are constantly new trends like AI, blockchain, social media, and so on. And it offers huge opportunities for founders and also big risks to be too early in a trend or to choose the wrong trend. In the following, you will see an interview with a serial entrepreneur with a lot of experience with different trends, Michael Tippet. His first business, one of the first web agencies in the 90s, where internet was in the infancy state. Before jumping into the interview, I will share the 4 most important learnings from that interview. Even with a big trend and new technology, you should prioritize real pains of the target audience, real problems. For example, Michael created later.com to schedule posts on Instagram. But Instagram didn't offer an API, so the tool was pretty clunky and not very user-friendly. But the users really needed this function, so they will still be using that despite the disadvantages of that tool. Nowadays, there are many AI solutions that sound pretty nice, but don't really solve a big problem. The second lesson from this interview is start within a small niche, try to dominate it, and then only expand. Like Hootsuite, for example, they started with just a URL shortener, and then they became a whole suite for social media management. In my opinion, the reason for that is that those new technologies are complex, fast moving, and the users don't know about them. So it's quite a lot of difficulty already. If you start within a small niche, it's much easier than if you try immediately with a big scale product. The third advice is don't get stuck in the planning mode. It's so difficult to predict what people are going to want and how they will react to that. Have a beginner's mind so that you think like you don't know anything and just experiment. Launch as soon as possible and see how people react to that. Instagram, for example, launched an alcohol review app first, but then realized that certain features are more popular among their users. So they removed all the other features, and that's what became Instagram. And finally, be aware of the shiny object syndrome, where you see cool things emerging, cool technologies, and you are trying this one, and you lose yourself. Instead, create a plan and execute. Understand what is the biggest problem of your target audience and try to fix that as effective as possible. It's not about learning all the technologies, diving deep, because they are going to disappear oftentimes and replaced by other technologies. It's about solving a problem. Those were my biggest takeaways from the interview. And if you would like to learn how to find a lucrative niche, how to find the right target audience with the right pain points, they have created a course that shows you step by step. You can reach that through masterfulhub.com. The first 7 days are for free, and after that, it's just $5 per month. And now let's move to the interview. You are a serial entrepreneur with so many years of experience, with so many different businesses and trends. Let's explore your experience as an entrepreneur and the lesson you learned that can, with the future trends, probably with all your experience from the past, you have the tools and the intuition to better evaluate the future and current trends. How did it start, your entrepreneurship?
I've been in the technology entrepreneurial space for a long time now, over 25 years. I started one of the first web design digital agencies in North America prior to 2000, actually. That was my first introduction to the startup world and to the technology world. You talk about trends. That was one example where I think we were probably too early. And people didn't really understand what the internet was. The web had become a thing that was just very new and very recent. People didn't really understand, well, why would I want to be on the internet? And so we were having to be super basic in terms of describing, okay, well, this is your digital storefront. And we had all of these kind of metaphors. People used to talk about things like the information superhighway, and this is your storefront on the information superhighway. It's really funny when you think about it now, but just convincing people that they needed to be on the internet was a big chunk of the work.
Let's explore the topic of being too early in a trend. How was it for you back then?
You spend a lot of time educating people. And I think actually for entrepreneurs, this is one of those big questions that people really should try to understand when they start a business is, are you creating a brand new category or are you entering an existing category and trying to build a better mousetrap, as it were? And I think that actually is one of the most foundational questions is, are you creating something that people have not ever seen before? In the case of our early days with the web, people were asking people to like pay for a website. Well, they didn't even know what a website was. They didn't even know what the internet was. And they certainly didn't know how it could be valuable to their business. And so you spend a lot of time educating people about that. And so you're really building the category. And so it's an uphill battle and takes a lot longer than it would if people already were building websites and now you were maybe competing on price or functionality or speed to market or some other attribute where you're in an established space and people understand why they're building a website. And so you're not having to make that argument. You're having to make the argument as to why you're better than your competitors. And so it really informs your entire strategy. There's the idea that like innovators can often end up with arrows in their back, right? Which is this notion that you're just too far ahead of the pack. Maybe you're the trailblazer. You're the one that actually breaks through and shows people the value of a space. But then for whatever reason, maybe your offering is not exactly what the market wants. And you kind of make all the mistakes that then the people who come after you take advantage of, learn from, and do a better job. This happens all the time in technology where you get someone who's a real visionary who's able to create a space, but not actually able to capture the value of that space. And then people come in after the fact and really own that market. Even the early days, if you go back to the early days of what we would call photo sharing at the time, you may not remember Flickr, but Flickr was sort of the first place where you could go and you could share photos with your friends. When they started Flickr, they sold it to Yahoo for, I think the reported number was something like $30 million. And then Instagram came along 10 or 15 years later and they sold it for 1.5 billion. And it was essentially the same application in some respects. In fact, Flickr was arguably better, but a really great example of how Flickr really created the category. And then Instagram came in and said, well, why don't we make the picture look a little nicer? And that became the billion-dollar company.
I think nowadays also everyone is looking at AI, but there are also other emerging trends like virtual reality. I mean, it's not that young, of course, or augmented reality. And Facebook has been working on that for quite some time, but then the market is not there yet. So they are spending billions and billions.
Yeah, VR is another one of those things. We were talking in the break about crypto and how that was not something that I'd really jumped on. And VR is another thing that I've been quite skeptical of, to be totally honest. I remember way back in the early days of the web, there was some early technology that we were exploring because we were interested in doing, really pushing the technology. That was another thing that I think, if I went back in history, would probably change my approach to where we were really trying to like do the most technically advanced stuff possible. And even in those early days of the web, there was some rudimentary video streaming, for example, and there was even some early VR. And so there was a technology called VRML, the virtual reality markup language. And so you could actually construct a world using almost a hypertext type language and create these virtual worlds. And so we actually did a lot of early experimentation with that, particularly in the real estate space, doing things like pre-sales, for example. So someone would say, well, what's my apartment going to look like when it's built? And we could build kind of a VR walkthrough. Technology has always been with us. But the thing for me that's always been the question is, what is the additional value that an immersive experience provides that just a more conventional experience doesn't provide? I think that you lose a lot with VR as well as you gain a lot. In the world, you're experiencing it. As the person who's building the media, who's trying to communicate something, you lose the ability to tell a story in a linear way that you can with even if you think about a web page, you could read a web page. It's an article, it's a blog post. The author can tell you a story, can make points, can be clear, can direct you. But in VR, it's really up to you. You're the author of your own experience. When you're trying to do something practical, like advertise a product and get someone to buy it, which is in some ways the foundation of most of our media these days, including Facebook, it's not necessarily the best mechanism to do that. I remember some of those early experiments, people were making things like virtual malls, and those always just seemed like kind of silly things, right? Like, why would you not rather just go to an Amazon page and scroll through all of the different computer screens or whatever it is that you're looking for rather than walk through a virtual mall. And so I always felt like people were using VR. It was kind of like a solution looking for a problem. And I still haven't seen like the killer app in VR in the same way that has been the case for like the web and for mobile and for social.
I think in the beginning of every trend, of every new technology, we are trying to implement the same things that have been before in the new technology. Like with the web, in the beginning, many things looked like flyers, like catalogs. And only after a while they adjusted, and it's the same with cars. The first car looked like a horse cart. So there is always a connection. And with VR, we can make so much more efficient the shopping by not having those malls going from one space to another, and just having those pictures and much better overview on Amazon or eBay. And so, yeah, there needs to be a solution for a real problem and not just because we can.
I think that's an interesting point, because one of the other things that entrepreneurs should think about is the level to which they want to disrupt a space. You bring up a really good point. There's a principle in product design where, I don't know if you've ever gone to the auto show. They show all of the cars that they're working on. They always have these crazy concept vehicles, and you go there and you think, oh my God, this is amazing. Look at what BMW has created. If only I could buy this car. And they never sell the concept cars because they're too radical. They're too new. People are not ready for them. People have a limit to what they can imagine in terms of novelty. And so there is sort of maximum level of innovation that if you go beyond that, people just get confused. I think that is one of the key things in successful innovation. You hit the solution at the right level of disruption where it's an order of magnitude better than the previous solution. So people will make the switch. You think about, okay, well, I've always used Microsoft Word, but I'm going to now move to Google Docs. There needs to be things in that new technology that are so much better that you're actually going to abandon your existing practice and adopt a whole new technology, which is very difficult to do. That's probably the most difficult thing in getting people to use a new product, is to change their behavior. And so if you're going to change someone's behavior from using Microsoft Word in one case to Google Docs, there needs to be a really good reason for it, right? And so in those early days of Google Docs, the argument was, well, you can collaborate with others on creating a document. Well, that's amazing. You know what? I'll forgo all of the bells and whistles that Word has with better formatting and all of the things that Word was much better at doing than those early versions of Google Docs. But you get people kind of over the line. And then, as is the case with many disruptive innovations, those new technologies get better at a faster rate than the older technologies do. And so at some point they reach parity, and they are as good as Microsoft Word in this case. And then all of a sudden, that's where you have those tipping points where the old technology can become obsolete almost overnight. The key as an entrepreneur is to understand what the attributes are of that new product that are really going to sell and are going to get people who are either users of the existing older technology or who have never thought to use the technology in the first place to adopt what you're doing. And then if you can get that early group of users, those early adopters, because you've built the right sets of features and benefits for those people, then as you improve the product, you get to the point where you're as good as the old product. And once that happens, then you really own the market because you're moving faster, you're evolving faster. You've got these attributes of like future-oriented customer base, but you also have the same functionality as the old technology. That's the key, really, is to be like really laser focused on the benefits that your new technology provides that the old technology didn't, because you're never going to, at the gate, have a tool that's as good as the previous technology. And, the AI film space is interesting in that regard, because AI film and what you can do with AI, generative AI in terms of making films and videos, is really incredible. And over the last year, if you've been following the space, you've seen that rapid advancement. But there's still many things you can't do with AI film that you can do with traditional. There's kind of a deficit in terms of the quality of the work at the end of the day, as measured by some traditional measures. But there's things you can do. You can construct a set on Mars in 5 minutes. You can imagine scenarios that would be physically very, very expensive to build. You can go back and redo audio. You can translate things into different languages. You can do things very, very quickly. AI filmmaking has an agile element to it that traditional filmmaking doesn't. It's almost like agile software development in that sense, where you're kind of making it up as you go along. So if you're making an AI film, you can improvise. So those are the things that make AI better than traditional film. And so when I'm working in the AI film space, those are the projects that I think are interesting, is where can we take advantage of where this technology is good? Because we know that there's areas where it's not as good. And the early days of the web were the same, right? So you talked about like how the early websites were kind of like flyers. Absolutely. And they were terrible flyers. They were bad flyers, right? The typography was bad. Initially, they were just basically black and white. Then you could get images. And so they were so much worse than a beautiful glossy color printout. But you could put it on the internet and people all over the world could access it. So on the one hand, you had this lower production value in terms of the quality. But on the other hand, you had the ability to reach potentially millions of people with a lower quality product, but with a wider reach. And so ultimately, it was the reach that got people onto the web, and they were okay with the lower production values. And then eventually the production values got so good that you can now do stuff on the web that is obviously impossible in print.
With all those trends, we sometimes forget how many trends didn't survive. You jumped on the right trends, but during this period of time, there were also so many other trends that didn't survive, or they had small spike and then it was over pretty fast. And usually we don't think about it. For many people, it seems like, okay, I just have to jump on any trend that is coming that seems to have potential, and then I will become very successful because I'm so early. But that's not true.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's one school of thought that says tactics are for amateurs, it's really about strategy. And there's another school of thought that says strategy is for amateurs, it's really about tactics. I think both are true, but I think in the startup world, you can be right about a lot of things. But if you just get a few things wrong, it can really torpedo the whole business. As an entrepreneur, you have successes, but you also have many failures. And there's many things that I've done that didn't work. And generally, they didn't work because of, I would say, like tactical considerations, right? There's definitely, I think in technology, there are these cycles where old ideas get recycled in many respects, right? Some of the early failures in the Web 1.0 world became huge successes in the Web 2 and Web 3 world. I think about DoorDash and all of these food delivery services. People tried that in the late 90s and they were catastrophic failures. And people just thought, what are you, crazy? You're trying to deliver food? This is never going to work. And it didn't work for 20 or 30 years. And then all of a sudden, the supporting technology was there. So it's one thing to do it on your home computer in the days before laptops and smartphones. But then all of a sudden, when you got a smartphone, well, the whole food delivery thing gets completely transformed. And it's easier to use. And you have kind of payment gateways that people are connected to. And you have these network effects that didn't exist before. And all of a sudden, a business that was fundamentally not viable becomes, one of the most valuable companies in the world. I think that's one of the interesting things about the AI world these days too, is that it's almost like everyone has that startup idea that they thought they were going to do, and then AI came along and they're like, I'm going to do that plus AI. It's been interesting to see sort of all of these ideas that, have been around for many, many decades now take advantage of AI. And AI is making possible businesses that were impossible, even 6 months ago. There's problems that need solving, and then there's technology that comes online that opens up new possibilities. And you need a kind of a configuration of technology often. You think about all of the things that go into making a car sharing service or food delivery possible. There's just so much stuff that you take for granted. The fact that you're able to pull up your phone in the middle of the street and call a service online, the fact that you can pay for it online, the fact that people can rate drivers, all of these technologies that took decades to build are now just kind of a given. Even signing up for a website and having your identity be authenticated used to be a challenge. These are things that you don't even think about anymore.
Sometimes maybe it's a good idea to, if you have a business idea and then you put yourself into the shoes of the user, and then you realize, oh, there is some puzzle pieces are missing. For example, the mobile phone or the storage for videos back then in the Web 1.0. And then you say, okay, maybe it's better to archive the idea for now and look at it in 5 years when the new technology develops.
Absolutely. Timing is so critical. But I think the big thing is really, what's the motivation? You said putting yourself in the shoes of the end user. And I think that's absolutely key to any successful business is, People talk about empathy, like the idea of empathizing with the customer and what is that customer's need and who are they? And I think successful companies really are able to get into the head of the customer and what is the problem that you're trying to solve. There's a great line that I've used many times, which is that customers are not looking for a drill, they're looking for a hole in the wall. And they're looking for a solution. They don't really care how you get the hole in the wall. And your job as a product designer is to build, in this case, a drill. But it doesn't have to be a drill. It could be any number of solutions. But at the end of the day, it needs to get that hole in that wall for that customer. And so understanding what it is that they want and how badly they want it, how important it is that you get this hole in the wall. Is it like really, really important? If so, you've got something. If not, maybe it's too early. And then there's other considerations like, are they willing to pay for it? You may really want a hole in the wall, but if someone says, I'll do that for you, but it's going to cost you $10, well, maybe I don't need it so badly. And so all of these are questions about what the end user is looking for and how badly they need this thing. The deeper people can understand that mindset, like there's this idea in acting, right, where you could be a method actor. And so you can, and some great actors do this, right? They go on set and they pretend to be the character that they're acting. And I almost feel like as a good product designer or an entrepreneur, you kind of need to be a method actor where you really need to get into the headspace and live the life of your customer. And that's why people say, you need to eat your own dog food or drink your own champagne or whatever the phrase is these days, where you should use your own technology. In doing so, you'll really understand the needs of the customer. And that is the most important thing, because if you're building something that has value, people will climb over the obstacles that will inevitably be in place to adopt your technology. And I've often thought that some of the best tests of whether you have a good value proposition and are bringing real value to the market is if you can build a customer experience that's difficult to use and people will still figure it out. For example, with our experience with Later, the social media company I was part of came online during the early days of Instagram. And so we were the first scheduling tool that allowed you to post to Instagram. But it was very difficult. We actually built it before Instagram built out their API. And so we had all of these really clunky ways of integration. It was a very lightweight integration. It didn't work very well, and yet people still used it, right? And so we thought, well, if people are still using the technology, even though it's this difficult to use, then we're really solving a problem for them, and then as the technology got more advanced, then we were able to make the user experience better and sign up process was easier and authenticating was easier and all of these other problems kind of fell away. The business just took off because we'd actually put our finger on something that was a real issue for people. In building out your company, like the people always say, you got to reduce friction, you got to make it easy as possible. And that is 100% true. You should always aspire to that. But there are cases where sometimes that friction is in place and people still use the product. That's when you really know you've got a winner on your hands.
Yeah, many ideas, they sound nice on paper. And everyone you asked would even maybe say, yeah, that's a nice idea.
Yes.
But if it comes to payment, it's a completely different topic.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the competitive landscape right now is so intense. You think about all of the people who are coming up with ideas in their basement or doing their own startups or working in an accelerator or just doing something in their university dorm. The number of people trying to create new technology right now is just inconceivable. If you just try to think about all the people who are doing things, it's really, really important that you are able to articulate specifically what you're doing and how it's different than your competitors. That's as important as timing. It's as important as your technology strategy. It's as important as the team you have around you is how you can convey what it is that you're doing in a way that differentiates you and makes you unique. When I was working in New York, we ended up working with one of the big agencies there. They were a branding agency, big Madison Avenue firm. And I remember they had a line that has really stuck with me, which is that a good brand makes the biggest promise you can own. And there's two pieces of that. One is make the promise, or, you're a pizza delivery app, right? Or what is the thing that you do? And then the second part of it is that you can own. And so that's the defensibility part of it. And so people talk about moats and how defensible your business is. Well, you need to be able to own the promise. The bigger the promise is, the harder it is to own. If you wanted to own pizza delivery globally, that's a big promise. If you want to own pizza delivery in the downtown area of Vancouver, maybe you can own that, right? That's a smaller thing, but you could be the number one company in that space. And to me, that is one of the critical components to having a successful startup is really understanding the space that you play in and where you're better than anyone else in the world. And sometimes that means you're doing something really, really small, but you're doing it better than anyone in the world. And you think about there's all these companies that just do really crazy things like, URL shorteners, for example, right? Where you take a long URL and you make it into a short URL. It seems like such a ridiculous technology in some respects. How could that be valuable? How could you build a company out of that? And yet there were companies that did that actually became the best shorteners in the world. Next thing, that was how Hootsuite started. You could actually build an entire company on that. Don't be surprised at the power of a really small, well-conceived idea. Because once you get that first piece of functionality and you get people using the tool for something that is valuable to them, you build on that. And that's how a lot of these companies, Facebook is a great example of that. They started off with some very rudimentary technology and they just added to it. But it starts with getting that kind of initial beachhead where you're doing something better than anyone else in the world. And even if it's a small thing, if you're the best at it, you can attract a global audience.
I think the key for that, if you are in front of the trend, then you realize faster and sooner what is missing. For example, if you are in front of the web trend and maybe SEO, and then you realize certain ideas like the URL shortener or social media, and then you are the first one who can implement this idea, and suddenly you have a huge competitive advantage versus there are so many entrepreneurs nowadays who have the same background. Maybe they completed their university and they have a similar lifestyle and they come up with similar business ideas, some kind of chatbot, for example, or they work for a company and they realize, okay, we can improve a certain how to acquire clients. And then suddenly you have so many more competitors compared if you are with a unique experience.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I've had some experiences where you see that groupthink. I remember years ago, I was in Silicon Valley for a conference, and it was about location-based technology. And so this was back when companies like Foursquare were popping up, and people were, for the first time ever, realizing that they could kind of geolocate on their mobile devices and use that data to tag themselves in coffee shops or what have you, write reviews. Location-based media was really hot back then and people were using it. So the whole conference was really about geolocative media. And I remember we went out after the conference, we were at a bar somewhere near Stanford and the place was closing down. And so people wanted to know what was happening next. You're at a geolocative media conference. So everyone starts pulling out their apps and looking for things and what's around and what's close by. And I just walked up to the bartender and I said, where do we go? And it turned out that they were much more useful than any of these apps. Sometimes old technology works better than new technology, but you're absolutely right. Some of the most interesting companies in the world have been started by people who have very unconventional backgrounds. And I think that's one of the exciting things about AI is that it really is opening up the field to people who are not necessarily just computer science graduates, even like 10 or even 5 years ago. To be a successful entrepreneur in the technology space, you really need to know how to build something. Many early companies are, two co-founders who've just graduated out of the top computer science program and are writing something, coding something. But I think nowadays with AI and the ability to kind of, the vibe coding gets overused, but this idea that you can apply non-technical skills to innovation, I think have never been a bigger opportunity. There's a really big opportunity for people who are in non-technical fields these days. If you're in the humanities, if you understand something about history or sociology or philosophy or political science, literature, those actually will often give you a perspective that you can use to come up with new things that are not sort of conventional solutions to problems that a small group of people are interested in.
When you first started in the web, you felt like it's too early. How was it with your next businesses? With your next trends? Did you feel in retrospective that it was a good timing? And how did you achieve this timing?
Yeah, so I would say on balance, I was generally too early. And the other thing too is that I would say over the course of the last 20 plus years, the speed of technology has accelerated. If you were a year too early back in 2000s, that would be the equivalent of like being, 3 months too early in 2025, right? Or 2 weeks too early. This rate of change has just accelerated to the point where things change and evolve much more quickly. If I were to go back knowing what I know now, I would have thought through the web design business a bit more and gone out a bit later because a lot of the companies that did better than we did started later and learned from our mistakes. You're battling all of these initial technology hurdles, things like compatibility with browsers. In those early web design days, it was crazy. You have to build websites that were compatible with 2 or 3 different browsers. You have to imagine that, right? And then I would say the news service we built that used mobile phones to let people file reports, also too early on that front. The issue with that was that there wasn't really a standardized way of getting photographs to a web service. Depending on the carrier you used and the mobile device you had, the photo that came into the service would be very different. Sometimes they would have kind of headers or meta information that we'd have to strip out. And so we'd have to build all this technology to parse through all of that stuff just to get to the image. And now these days, it's as easy as sending a text message to someone. And so, but the point you made earlier is also an important one, which is that it's the people who are kind of in the arena who really anticipate what those issues are and can solve them faster than the people who are just thinking about them theoretically. And so I think that's also something that I really would encourage entrepreneurs to do is get out of the building, stop planning, stop putting stuff on paper, like really go out and try and sell what you're doing. Try to get someone to pay for what you're selling, because that's where you're really going to learn those lessons. And you're going to figure out like, what are the impediments to people adopting your product? Because the impediments that you think are going to be in place are never going to be the ones that are in place. The things you think are going to be problems are often not the problems that you encounter. And the only way that you can really get clarity around that is by getting out there, doing it, trying to sell stuff and figuring out why that doesn't work and fixing those problems. And if you can fix those problems, then you get to the promised land and you will be a successful entrepreneur. And if you die along the way, then you won't. And that's the way that works.
How influenced your first experience the success of your second experience? Did it help you that you built this web agency to build the next project?
Yeah, I mean, they say that, in war, the generals are always fighting the last war. And I think that's true kind of in the technology space where, on the one hand, there's always lessons to be learned from what you're doing. But the challenging thing about technology is that you're never jumping in the same river twice. If you do something and then 5 years later you do something else, even though you've learned kind of general lesson that you can apply across the board, everything is different. The technology is different, culture is different, expectations are different, risk tolerance is different in the customer base, people's ability and willingness to adopt is different. Sometimes you'll find that the lessons that you learn from one experience are the wrong lessons in the new experience. I would say the key things to think about as an entrepreneur is the journey you're setting out on is a journey of the unknown. It's like the early European explorers who didn't really have maps of the world, and they got on ships and they just kind of went out looking for one continent and they accidentally found another one. That's often what happens with technology companies is that, you look at a company like Instagram. I mean, initially they set out to build like a whiskey app. And they just pivoted, and then finally, like, oh my gosh, people are just really interested in doing this. And so you can kind of dig and as long as you're like listening and watching what your customers are looking for and responding to, you can often find things that you didn't expect as the use cases for your technology or the way that people are using what you're building. That to me is the overarching lesson that I would put out there is just be responsive to what people are saying and how they're using your technology, because they will often use it in ways that you didn't expect. And don't be dogmatic, have a vision, have a clear vision as to where you want to kind of end up, generally speaking, but allow yourself to be kind of pushed tactically in ways that you never anticipated, and have what the Zen Buddhists call beginner mind, right, where you know nothing. Assume you know nothing about your customers and then listen to them. They say that good salespeople don't talk for more than 40 seconds at a time, right? You talk for 40 seconds and then you listen. That's how you sell to someone, is that you understand what their needs are and you do more listening than you do talking. And I think that's true for any introduction of any new technology. Is you need to listen to your customers and you need to be able to listen to them. You need to be able to measure what they're doing, track their activity, listen to their feedback, incorporate that feedback, figure out what of that feedback is pertinent and relevant and represents the consensus or something that is useful for a lot of people versus something that is just a squeaky wheel that one person is interested in. Being attuned to what your customers want and adaptive and responsive and humble enough to assume that like you don't have all the answers when you go into a new market or new product, because you will be constantly surprised.
That's a very valuable advice. Thank you so much. In current times, if you start a AI startup and you mentioned the time, the development is so fast, what would you advise to entrepreneurs how to cope with this fast development?
I mean, that's a very good question. And it's something that we wrestle with all the time. From one week to the next, the technology in AI video is evolving so quickly. I think one of the tensions that we have is figuring out if you really go deep into a technology to try and understand it and become the world's leading expert in that technology, or do you just understand the basics of it, understanding that that's probably not going to be the technology you're going to use 6 months from now. And so you don't want to necessarily have a bunch of stranded investment in technology that is obsolete. So I think one thing to do is to sort of understand or try to evaluate how critical specific technology is going to be in the grand scheme of things and evaluate how deeply you want to go into it. And that's as much art as science. There's not necessarily like an empirical answer to that question. A lot of it is kind of your gut and your instinct. So just being really judicious about where you invest your time, because this technology is so interesting and so fascinating and inspiring. And so it's very easy to just become completely absorbed in what you can do with it. And so just being mindful of that and aware of the fact that there's so many different things that you can focus on. And then I think the other thing would be you should be kind of aware of the competitive landscape and what other people are doing around you and how you fit into that. But I also think that you can get overwhelmed with that and trying to understand, oh my gosh, there's just a bazillion things happening at once. How am I going to possibly wrap my head around it? And sometimes you just need to kind of ignore the noise and just continue moving forward and to put that aside and just chase your vision with like blind devotion and hope that you're right. Because these entrepreneurial journeys are adventures. They're ventures into the unknown. And so you have to be comfortable with a degree of the unknown and just kind of boldly moving ahead in spite of the fact that you don't fully understand what's happening around you, because especially in this day and age, it really is impossible to stay on top of things. I mean, I'm in the space, I'm 24/7 and I'm following it as closely as I can. And there's still lots of things that I am not able to keep up with.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Would you our audience to do something? Could to connect with you on LinkedIn or visit your website?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn under Michael Tippet. The key is 2 P's and 2 T's. But if you search for me on LinkedIn, you will find me. And you can also go to tippet.org, tippett.org. And that's got a link to all of my social handles and all the various companies that I've started, including Generation Studios, which is at generation.film. So people can check that out. It's free to use. You can try it, test it out, and submit your movie idea, and we'll have a look at it and give you a screenplay and help you get that started. So I encourage people to test it out and see what they come up with.
Amazing. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right.